Hello and hello everybody. Welcome to our monthly webinar series. I am Anna Popovich, Program Director at Humanist Canada and your host this afternoon. This webinar will be 60 minutes in length with a question period at the end of the presentation. If you have a question and would like to ask it directly, please raise your hand at the bottom of the screen. You can also submit your question or comment with the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen anytime throughout the presentation. And this webinar will be recorded. Our guest today is Karis Burkowski, co-author of Why Man Made God, Redefining the Sacred, a book about the evolution of modern Western culture published in 2015. The book is available for purchase from Humanist Canada at our online store, shop.humanistcanada.ca, and I'll put the link in the chat. Karis has been fascinated by concepts of mythology, culture, and social evolution since her early teens. 50 years later, she's still engaged with that research. Karis has been a member of Interfaith Grand River since its inception in 2001 and is a past president of the Society of Free Thinkers, or SoFree. In 2019, she became a humanist officiant, providing non-religious options to people wishing to celebrate life's important passages. Welcome, Karis.
Like many of you, I was raised in a religious home and community. I lost my faith at about age 13. I was in a confirmation class, and the minister was teaching us about transubstantiation and consubstantiation. That's the concept that when he says the magic words, the bread and wine become the actual body and blood of Christ, and then we consume them. My first thought was, I'm not a cannibal. I'm not doing that. But my next thought, which was more important, was, wait a minute, I'm just not that easy to trick. This is crazy. And that began my interest in learning about how this Judeo-Christian spirituality, which so dominated the culture around me that I couldn't even safely admit that I no longer believed any of it, came to be. I grew up, life got busy, and I didn't do much about all this, but I kept reading and making notes. After I retired, about half a century later, I started putting some things on the internet about what I had learned. In 2013, someone named Fleming sent me an email challenging something I had posted. He too had been studying this topic for years, and after several discussions, we decided to write a book about it. And then I found out that he was a Scot living in France in the process of moving to Thailand. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if you can see it. Co-authoring this book with a complete stranger on the other side of the planet was unquestionably a 21st century experience. Without the internet and modern social media, it would never have happened. We have never met and have only had 2 telephone conversations, which were about the time that we were making the publishing contract. Everything else was done by email. Why Man Made God was published in the summer of 2015, but it's just as relevant today. The book explores the evolution of modern Western culture from Palaeolithic times to the present. It focuses on the evolution of religions, since they play a significant part in our culture. Using research from archaeology, anthropology, mythology, biology, sociology, and history, it tells the story of what happened, why it happened, and where we can go from here. Our past explains our present. Most of you already know that DNA evidence indicates that humanity as we know it first evolved in East Africa and migrated from there in many groups over many thousands of years across the world. According to the National Geographic Society, the optimal size for a hunter-gatherer tribe is about 100 people. When groups got too large, they would split, and some would move on to a new area where they would settle. If the hunters spotted a better area, they might move again. There was no final destination in mind. They might not move again for 100 years. Our focus is on one small group that left Africa around 55,000 years ago, traveled up the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, and continued on to what is now the Middle East. Although one could walk that far in about a year, it took these ancestors of ours thousands of years to get there. It is important to realize that these people were just as highly evolved as we are. During the day, they would gather fuel and forage for food and prepare it. And as the sun set, they would gather around the fire to eat and chat and tell stories to amuse and entertain each other. The stories they told would have taught lessons or provided warnings and established the moral rules for the group. They would have tried to understand who they were and where they came from, just as we do. Take this picture of modern humans, add some shaggy beards and long hair, change the t-shirts to animal skins, and remove the glasses from that guy in the back, and they would have looked pretty much like this. Those who clustered together in the evening were less likely to become prey, get lost, or have an accident in the dark. So entertaining the group, making it stay together, would have had an evolutionary benefit. Storytelling, the basis of all art, became innate to humans. This telling of stories was the beginning of the oral tradition, the origin of mythology. Key elements of these myths were retained and handed down for hundreds of generations. Humans seek design and agency in everything. When we see random pictures, we interpret them in anthropomorphic terms. When we see faces in rock formations, in the branches of trees, and in clouds. We see causality in random events and constantly ascribe a sense of agency to the world around us. This is the root of the earliest belief system we know of, animism, which holds that everything, and depending on the culture, this may include inanimate things like rivers, mountains, and storms, contains a spirit force that can be helpful or malign, benevolent or dangerous, depending on how we behave toward it. Margaret, would you please read from section 1, the first goddess, the sea, page 2, second paragraph, through to the end of the second paragraph on page 3 from the book?
Women living by the sea would have noticed that their menstruation coincided with the same phase of the moon and pattern of tides. They knew that when they gave birth, first came their waters, and it was within these that their babies had grown. Everywhere they looked, the sea's water teemed with living things. What created this life? Having experienced the pain, delirium, and delight of bringing forth life themselves, women must have wondered at the sea, always at the moment of parturition, constantly creating life on an immeasurable scale. The natural reaction of a human mother pondering the mysteries of life beside the sea would be to conceptualize it as a living being, but on a scale so great as to be beyond comprehension. She would create in her mind a being with attributes like hers, yet multiplied immeasurably in power. This being would be the animating force that guided the mighty sea and controlled not only its destructive force, but also its power of creation. The woman would create a deity, a great mother. At that moment, the goddess opened her eyes and smiled on the children who so fondly invented her. She answered their deep psychological need to know about themselves and to find a reason for their lives. The goddess sea provided for the people, and in return, the people praised the sea, came to worship her as their mother. They found spiritual purpose in devotion to her. The sea features in the original creation myth in many ancient cultures. We shall look in detail at the Sumerian mythology, the earliest, for which we have a written record, because it directly informs so many other later cultures. Here, the first goddess was Namu, the eternal sea, who created alone the earth and the sky in her womb. This element in the creation myth of a people who lived so far inland may be a lingering folk memory of a time when their ancestors lived by and from the sea, which was their first mother, their protector, their goddess.
This image was sent to me by a woman named Pat Haney, who was inspired to create it after she read that passage. Mother Goddess Sea became Mother Goddess Earth, but she was still the great mother, the creator of all life. She was undeniably female, and she created life independently, without a partner. Since mating does not always lead to procreation, and 9 months is a long time, and the first months of pregnancy are not visible, perhaps people did not fully understand the process of reproduction. Alternatively, as those of us who've had babies know, the first small signs of pregnancy are noticeable almost immediately to the mother. So it is quite possible that the mothers among the women knew and guarded this women's wisdom. Either way, women had the babies, and the babies were essential to the survival of the tribe. As in existing hunter-gatherer tribes today, the women were important for another reason as well. The brave hunters might bring home the feasts, but it was the foragers who provided the food that fed the tribe on a daily basis. This fact, plus the seemingly miraculous ability of the women to create life, gave women status. Belief in a great mother endured for most of human history. Mother Goddess figurines, like the Venus of Willendorf, have been discovered across Europe and into Asia and as far north as Siberia, and carbon dated. This one, found in Austria, is estimated to have been carved of stone 35,000 years ago from a type of stone found in Italy on the other side of the Alps and tinted red with ochre. This replica of the Venus of Willendorf was cast from the original, and I picked it up at the Natural History Museum in Vienna, where the original rests in a large glass case. The second one, the Venus of Dostanice, was made of fired clay about 2,500 years ago and was found near Prague in the Czech Republic. The third, the Venus of Lesbos, comes from France around 26,000 BCE. And the last one is from 6,500 BCE from the Halaf culture in Mesopotamia. About 10,000 years ago, the group of early humans that directly led to modern Western culture foraged, gathered, and hunted its way to Mesopotamia, the fertile area in what is now the Middle East. Food was plentiful, and there was fresh water, so we began to settle. At first, these were not permanent settlements, and we would move and return, following the migrating animals. Then something happened that allowed us to settle more permanently. In the hills of the Levant, in an area near what is now Tel Aviv, the foragers found abundant wild forms of wheat and barley that could be cooked and eaten. We made crude bread from crushed grains, mixed with a little fat and water, and baked on a stone set over a fire. Grains have crucial benefits that set them apart from other foods gathered by foragers. And the most significant is that they can be stored. Grains will remain good for a decade or more if kept dry. For hundreds of years, we continued to live much as we had, gathering wild grains and storing them, and hunting antelope and other game, but now from a settled home base. Around this time, we began to domesticate animals. Some, like dogs, partly self-domesticated, while others, like goats, probably came to live with us when the hunters killed the parents and took the baby animals home. It didn't take long for the foraging women to notice that dropped grains that got wet would sprout. And soon we were using pointed sticks to plant them close to the settlement. This simple, small-scale horticulture made life a bit easier. Cereal grains took on even more importance once two other properties were discovered. The first was that grain soaked in water so that it begins to sprout tastes sweet. We now understand that moistened grain produces diastase enzymes, which convert starch in the grain to malt. The second was that if this gruel was left sitting around for a couple of days, it underwent a mysterious transformation. It became fizzy and pleasantly intoxicating. In short, it turned to beer. We had abundant food, water, a varied diet of both meat and plants close to home, and we had bread and beer. Of course, we settled there permanently. By this time, we had a concept of Mother Earth and Father Sky. The Sky Father brought the rain and the sunshine and could be called upon in times of drought or storm. But he was more or less like a queen's consort. The Earth Mother did all the work of creating life. We lived for a few thousand more years in small, scattered villages of subsistence farmers and hunters. And then everything started to change. In order to grow more of this wonderful grain, we developed agriculture. The Sumerians in southern Mesopotamia saw beyond their immediate needs. They built miles of huge canals that linked the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, irrigating the land and turning it green. This was civil engineering on a grand scale that would continue for thousands of years. Now, in this image, you can see a Sumerian cedar planting machine. And you can see the gentleman in the middle there, behind the animals, is dropping the seeds into the funnel, which goes down to the ground, and the person at the back shoots them into the ground. Those Sumerians had some pretty clever things. This one is copied from a clay tablet that was carbon dated to be from that period. The Sumerians prospered, and their main settlement, Uruk, became the world's first city with over 50,000 people. The Sumerian Earth Mother, who they called Inanna, was beautiful, sophisticated, and mercurial, yet fickle and willful. She was a goddess of women, love and sex, fertility and war, and at least in her earliest forms, was completely independent of male control. Now here's a rendering of the village of Uruk from a scientific illustration and archaeological reconstruction site. The people built the first monumental structure, a stepped pyramid called a ziggurat, at the center of the city. On top, they built a beautiful home for the great goddess who had brought them so much, the Iana temple, the house of heaven. This was not only the home of the goddess, but the center of religious life of the city, seat of political power, and the courts. And you can see the crowds assembling, and they would come around and come in through the main entrance. This is where most of the sacrifice activity would occur. Then there would be a lesser group that could go into here, and only the high priest could go up into the highest temple. Margaret, would you please read another passage from the book? Read from the middle of page 94 to near the end of page 95.
In a hunter-gatherer worldview, where one simply harvests nature's bounty, time is effectively limitless. There is no pressure to do something today or tomorrow, or even this or next year. Agriculture required that things be done on time. The fields plowed, the seed sown, the earth hoed, the harvest gathered, and so on. Huge areas of land had to be cleared, tilled, and irrigated, and this required an organized workforce of physically strong workers, a workforce of men. In the agricultural phase, a new reward system was invented, which put material value on time and effort. In other words, on work. The men would own the harvested produce that they grew on the land they worked, and this could be shared and traded. Those who put in the time and effort most effectively, or who had been fortunate enough to begin working the best land, had the most successful crops. Some began to amass more wealth in terms of produce surplus to their needs than others. A new economic model was born based on surplus produce and its accumulation as wealth. Gradually, the wealthiest were able to buy produce from the others and market it themselves. The market economy and the establishment of individual property rights soon followed. Increased trading led to the invention of money, which appeared in Sumer in the 4th millennium BCE. Money could be saved, stored, and transported more easily than produce, and most importantly, it meant that commerce was no longer reliant on barter. Money could be traded for anything. The inevitable result was that everything was given a monetary value, even the land, rather than being held communally, was divided up so that it could be bought and sold. Instead of a workers' collective owning and cultivating the land, some men became owners and some laborers. Ultimately, this led to the development of a culture in which all material wealth and power was concentrated in the hands of a small number of men. To protect their rights to money and land, these men invented systems of law that defined what property was, who owned it, and what would happen to those who usurped these rules. The divisions between rich and poor were established here. This model was so successful that large amounts of surplus were soon being created. This allowed the building of ever larger and more sophisticated settlements.
We have seen how agriculture led to social stratification. It gets worse. Slavery was relatively unknown in pre-civilization hunter-gatherer populations. It became common in Sumer as far back as 3500 BCE, when slaves were used for the hardest, dirtiest jobs, such as milling. Slavery features in the Code of Hammurabi, circa 1750 BCE, which contains 6 clauses about punishment for escaped slaves. This naturally led to an early form of policing, as well as private armed militias, to enforce those laws, recapture the slaves, and punish anyone who helped them. Because grain fields cannot be hidden or moved, grain also served as an excellent basis for taxation. It could be assessed, stored, confiscated, and rationed. The taxing of wheat enabled the non-productive elites to form a ruling class. Wheat is nutrient poor but energy dense. It provided just enough energy and health to work, breed, and fight. The early grain states were population machines, where the elites dominated the lower classes and domesticated them, much as farmers domesticate herds. With the advent of agriculture, we had a new relationship with nature. It was at least partly under our control. And with this, we see the arrival of anthropomorphic deities. Mother Earth and Father Sky had by this time birthed many generations of gods and goddesses. The original Mother Goddess was so vast as to be almost beyond comprehension. But these new anthropomorphic deities were different. They were very similar to us. They could be reasoned with. They were close to us. Indeed, they seemed to like us, and all the more if we worshiped them or gave them offerings. Furthermore, they could be loyal to specific groups of us, which reflects the emergence of settlement and city dwelling. Each city or region could have a goddess or god of its own, who might be persuaded to live there and give it her or his protection. We built homes for them, which we called temples, and provided food or other offerings. Here we see the goddess Athena, who graced the Parthenon at the Acropolis for 1,000 years. Dedicated in 438 BCE, she was the goddess and protector of the city of Athens and holds Nike, winged victory, in her hand. The statue was about 11.5 meters tall and was made of carved ivory for the flesh parts and gold for everything else, all wrapped around a core of cypress wood. This faithful replica was built by sculptor Alain Lequier and gilded in real gold in 2002. It stands inside a faithful replica of the Parthenon, built in 1897 in Nashville, Tennessee. Before the singing hillbillies and honky-tonkers came to town, Tennessee was known as the Athens of the South because it prided itself as the center of learning and enlightenment. This picture gives you some small sense of what the followers of these anthropomorphic deities would have felt when they went to worship and make their sacrifices. Virtually all of the deities were represented in a similar manner in their respective temples. They may have walked among the people, but they were gigantic, with powers to match. In hunter-gatherer and even horticultural societies, women were self-sufficient. They could gather or grow enough for their needs. Agriculture changed that. Once men controlled the land and the production of food, women became dependent on them, which gave men control over women. A new kind of property ownership contract called marriage was invented, giving men exclusive rights over and access to women's fertility. Margaret, please read what the Greek historian Herodotus wrote in the 5th century BCE about the Babylonian marriage market.
Once a year in each village, the young women eligible to marry were collected all together in one place, while the men stood around them in a circle. Then a herald called up the young women one by one and offered them for sale. He began with the most beautiful. When she was sold for a high price, he offered for sale the one who ranked next in beauty. All of them were sold to be wives. The richest of the Babylonians who wished to be wed bid against each other for the loveliest young women, while the commoners who were not concerned about beauty received the uglier women, along with monetary compensation. All who liked might come, even from distant villages, and bid for the women. This was the best of all their customs, but it has now fallen into disuse.
I never did like beauty pageants, and now I'll never be able to see one without thinking of this. For the emerging city-states, protection from attack overshadowed all other concerns. There's little point in growing food, making children, or building cities if these cannot be defended, if enemies can just come in and take everything. Great warriors were venerated and their violence and fighting abilities celebrated. War was soon as important as agriculture and as trade. Killing, Plunder and destruction had become a new economic model. As men assumed more power over nature and over women, the gods underwent a similar shift, and male gods became more powerful and warlike. Instead of embodying the miraculous ability to create life, women were now just humble vessels, like flower pots, in which the all-important male seed could grow. Powerful men could own many such vessels. From the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, war persisted with hardly a break throughout Mesopotamia. As the gods of some cities defeated others, those at the top of the deity hierarchy would subjugate those at the bottom, just as victorious rulers subjected the citizens of the conquered cities. And of course, they each demanded of their followers, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." Other cultures in other places were also evolving. Trade and conquest by the Assyrians, Babylonians, Egyptians, and Romans brought close contact with other deities and other mythologies. The Roman kingdom became the Roman Empire, and by about 100 BCE, the Romans had taken over Mesopotamia, making it a province of Rome and installing all their pantheon of gods and goddesses. The god of a small agrarian hill tribe in Judah certainly did not overthrow the gods of Rome in battle. Nonetheless, that god eventually became the god of the Roman Empire, and from there became the god of most of the Western world. You probably already know the part about how Rome had conquered many nations with many gods. The Emperor Constantine realized that it would help unite his empire if everyone worshipped the same religion, and he chose Christianity. In 325 CE, between May and August, he assembled religious delegates at the Council of Nicaea to define the Christian church doctrine and beliefs and determine what was heresy and what was accepted. Christianity became the Church of Rome, and the Roman army did the rest. Naturally, the conquered peoples resisted. For instance, the Gauls did not want to give up their great mother, so the humble vessel, Mary, had to be elevated to Mary, Mother of God, Queen of Heaven. Other deities were turned into saints so they could be included. How this all was achieved is a fascinating and complicated tale that takes up a significant part of the book. In condensing 55,000 years into a short talk, I've had to leave out many tantalizing stories, such as how and why the high priests killed off God's wife, Asherah, and then tried, not quite successfully, to remove all record of her from the Holy Scrolls that eventually became the Old Testament of the Bible. For example, in the book of Kings, there is a description suggesting that she was worshipped alongside Yahweh in his temple in Israel. If you do a Google search for Asherah in the Bible, later, not now, you may be surprised how many references you can find. Asherah's removal from the story begins around 587 BCE. The Babylonians destroyed Judah and took the scribes and upper classes into exile into Babylon. While in exile, the scribes reimagined the mythology of Yahweh. Instead of being their particular god in a pantheon of local deities, too weak to save his temple and his people, he was transformed into the one and only real God who had always existed and was omnipotent and omniscient. When the scribes returned from exile in Babylon, this was the story they marketed in an attempt to reclaim their power as the true priests of the true God. In order to separate themselves from their pre-Babylonian exile beliefs, they invented the story of Exodus from captivity by the Egyptians. It is a total fantasy. It never happened. In this story, it takes 40 years to make what Google Maps describes as a 2-week journey. On multiple occasions, God kills off the followers who were unfaithful until only the best of them survived. Moses leads them to conquer Canaan. This became their cultural origin story. In reality, they are the same people. And this takeover is really a superimposition of their new and revised beliefs and worship practices. It is significant to understand that it is only in the last 5,000 years or so, a very small percentage of the time humans have had what could be called religious beliefs, that a male God was given the power of creator of life. Let that sink in. A new creation story told us that rather than being born from a mother goddess, the first humans had been molded from dirt by a male god. A slightly different version in the same book of Genesis states that woman, Eve, was made from a rib of Adam, lesser and servile. And of course, Eve was disobedient and corruptible and to be blamed for all of life's misfortunes. The warrior kings were also the religious leaders, and their power was considered to have been given to them by their God. They could talk to God, and they knew what God wanted or decreed, which, big surprise, was always closely tied to what they wanted. The patriarchy had come of age. Please note that the word patriarchy is not a synonym for men. The patriarchy is a system, a pyramidal, hierarchical system in which everything benefits the 1% at the top. The other 99% are merely a support system for those in control. Low-wage workers, drafted soldiers, and so on can be sacrificed to support the 1%. Women and children have even lower status than men in this system, so they suffer most. But men also suffer under the patriarchy. I want to emphasize this. Patriarchy is not a synonym for men. It is a system in which everything is organized for the benefit of the powerful few at the top. Why Man-Made God explores the gradual, fascinating development of ideas like heaven and hell. They were no accident. Earlier concepts such as the Elysian fields or the dreary but not punitive underworld, which were simply attempts to explain what happens when we die, morphed into the idea of heaven as a wonderful paradise where obedient humans might go, paired with an opposite, hell. Hell was designed specifically to intimidate the living, so its horrors are grotesque. Every act in life would be judged. This patriarchal concept became the most effective form of social manipulation humanity has ever invented. It is important to remember that the patriarchy has only been in place for about 6,000 years. And even then, it started gradually. During that small fraction of human existence, we radically changed our attitudes to one another and to the planet. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors thought of the land as their mother. They would no more have dreamed of owning it than owning the clouds. They belonged to the land, and it provided for them. Once we commodified it, chopped it up into pieces that could be bought and sold, we no longer belonged to the land. It belonged to us. It became a resource to be plundered and turned into wealth. And the story told to justify this was that God had given Adam dominion over it to do with as he wished. The patriarchal, misogynistic Yahweh became the god of Rome around 400 CE, and the related beliefs were spread with the Roman conquest. Yahweh, the god of the Jewish people, was originally a storm god, and like Baal, was one of the 70 children of the high god El. I bet you didn't hear that in Sunday school. Even after having been spin-doctored by the exiled scribes and exalted to the position of the god of the Roman Empire, he was still an anthropomorphic deity, just like all the others. He had a body. He walked with and talked with people like Moses and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. He had human-like passions of anger and jealousy and violently killed large groups of people who were not obedient. And of course, he created human beings in his own image and likeness. This picture shows a cutaway view of Yahweh's temple as described in the Bible in 1 Kings 6-7. The throne, let me see if I can make that bigger for you. The throne was 10 cubits or 16 feet high, giving us some idea of Yahweh's stature. Remember that picture of Athena? Followers were instructed not to make any graven images, so his temple holds a throne rather than a statue. Later, in Ezekiel 1, 15-28, when the temple is destroyed, the large winged cherubim on either side of the throne come to life and safely remove Yahweh from his temple. As the Church of Rome grew, so did its God. In successive rewriting and retelling of the dogma, God went from being visible to certain exalted followers to being hidden in clouds or flames or blinding lights. When you restrict the visibility of something, it becomes more mysterious, more powerful. The visualization of God had gradually transformed from one anthropomorphic God among many to a mysterious hidden deity to an ethereal, all-powerful, omniscient concept without a body. In this formless form, he could be more vast and more awesome than anyone could even imagine. And the priests and popes who were his representatives on earth also grew in power. The influence of the Roman Catholic Church, backed up by the powerful Roman army and the nearly divine leaders, created what is called the Dark Ages, lasting from 400 CE to about 1400 CE. After tracing our history to this dystopian period, which, by the way, includes such delights as the Inquisition and the burning times, Why Man Made God goes on to describe how we began to find our way out. It talks about the Renaissance, when philosophical writings from the Greeks, those intellectual pagans, were rediscovered, leading to a surge in interest in classical scholarship and values. The invention of the Gutenberg press allowed such works to be printed and spread to the public. This led to the Enlightenment, starting about 1685, in which at last women were allowed to read and discuss such radical ideas as equal rights. Finally, in the early 1900s, we were officially declared to be persons under the law and allowed to vote. In the 1960s, when the pill came along, women even managed to regain control over our fertility and reproduction. In 1973, the Roe versus Wade decision cemented those rights in the US, and in 1988, following the R versus Morgenthaler case, we did the same in Canada. It looked as if we were on our way to achieving victory of scientific investigation over magical thinking, the separation of church and state, and equality of the sexes. But contrary to popular opinion, religion has refused to die. As we frequently see in the news, the patriarchal model is not giving up. It continues today in the disparity between the 1% and the 99%, in the attempts to roll back voting rights, the recent US Supreme Court's attack on women's reproductive rights and freedoms, and in the treatment of the earth as a resource with little or no concern for the environment. Understanding how Western culture evolved empowers us to recognize what we see happening now in a new light. When you watch the campaign ads for the US midterms, ramping up warlike, xenophobic fear-mongering, designed to make voters think they need lots of weapons and a great warrior to protect them, you will recognize that this kind of theocratic warrior culture has happened before. We wrote Why Men Made God back in 2014, in what I now refer to as the before times. Before Trump, before QAnon, before the religious fundamentalists controlled the US Supreme Court, before COVID. We did not anticipate voting rights being curtailed or an insane rise in conspiracy theories. We certainly did not anticipate book burnings. With the recent overturn of Roe versus Wade, American women's access to control over their own reproduction is being set back decades. When women are forced to have babies against their will, it is as if the state has asserted property rights over women's bodies, entrenching this through law and custom. This was the cornerstone of the patriarchy for thousands of years. Remember when I said the early grain states were population machines, where the elites domesticated the lower classes much as farmers domesticate herds? Can you see how forcing today's women to have babies would mean more low-wage workers, more consumers, more disposable soldiers, and so on? And of course, this only affects those who can't afford to travel for an abortion. Those at the top of the pyramid need lots of bodies at the bottom in order to maintain their power. They continue to want to farm people like herds with no concern about the quality of life for those individuals. And they have no problem using religion as a tool to those ends. We actually thought that with social media, cell phones, and the internet, we, the citizens, would now have tools and access to information we've never had before. And the difference that would make would save us from patriarchal propaganda and enable us to work together to save the planet from the climate catastrophe. Little did we know that the internet, particularly aspects like Facebook, Twitter, and the dark web, would end up being used to undermine democracy and critical thinking, putting us more at risk than ever. On the bright side, organizations like Humanist Canada and the Freedom from Religion Foundation have grown in popularity. The percentage of non-believers in the population is rising steadily. We now have humanist officiants who can perform legal marriages and other ceremonies, thus chipping away at the stranglehold that religions have historically had over those important moments in our lives. Based on an analysis of sociological, economic, and psychological factors, the nations deemed to be the happiest on earth are Finland, Denmark, Iceland, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Sweden, and Norway. And they are all among the most secular, least religious nations on earth. Now, picture Vladimir Putin wrapping his plans in religious values as he invades Ukraine with the blessing of the Russian Orthodox Church. Think of Donald Trump holding up his Bible and courting the evangelical far right as he tries to regain control. Think of the judicial attack on women's reproductive autonomy. When you understand the history of how Western culture evolved, you can immediately recognize the patterns in their actions. These are superpowers with nuclear weapons. In the US, the NRA has even armed the followers of these ideas with AR-15 military weapons. Which direction will the future take us? Will we become increasingly secular, or will we slide back into religious patriarchy? As I see it, it is more important than ever that everyone understands how we got to the state we're in. Religions have always been powerful tools deployed by those seeking to have absolute control over others. Only when everyone understands this will we be able to stop it from happening again and again. Our past explains our present.
Thank you, Karis, for this wonderful presentation and for taking us on a journey across history. We have some time for questions, and we have one from Ezra. And by the way, please submit your questions with a Q&A box, or you can also raise your hand and I'll ask you to unmute yourself. Indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest had no significant agriculture. However, in some tribes, about a quarter of the population was enslaved. Did agriculture bring about slavery?
I'm only talking here about the cultures that led to our modern Western culture. If other cultures had slavery, that really is not the point. I mean, yes, other cultures did have slavery, but other cultures also had very powerful roles for women where they were part of the ruling class. So, I mean, these other things happen in different parts of the world, that's true, but that's not the focus here.
Other questions? I have a question for you, Karis. What surprised you about your research?
Oh my goodness, everything surprised me about it. We started this without an end in mind. Like, we didn't have an answer that we were trying to get to. We were just curious. At least I was just curious, like, what made this culture happen? So when I found out things about Yahweh being just one of many, and when I found out just so many things about the history and the development of how we came to believe the things that we believe, I was blown away. But it just made me read more and more and more books.
Thank you. I think there was a bit of a lag.
I don't consider myself a historian at all. I'm just a populist. I just read lots of stuff and then try and pull it together in a format that will be easy for other people to understand.
Thank you, Karis. Another question. People are very worried about global warming. Surely birth control and family planning are important. There are too many people in the world. Why do you suppose no one talks about birth control in this context?
Why do I suppose no one talks about birth control?
This is not exactly related to your book, but I guess, yeah.
Well, I mean, the Supreme Court says they're going to go after birth control next. Like, they want more babies. That's it. They just want more people at the bottom of the pyramid to support the people at the top. Birth control has been part of our history throughout the ages. Even in the Stone Age, birth control was practiced. I mean, it was a little different than nowadays, but I mean, I wouldn't say nobody talks about it. I don't understand that question, really.
A question from Jason. Thank you for this presentation. It was so concise and articulate. How can we go on spreading this gospel, quote unquote? More people should know this information. So how can people share your information?
I absolutely agree with that. More people need to know this history and how we got to here. I would say support the work of Humanist Canada, support the work of other Freedom for Religion and other groups like that, to help people see that there's an alternative to people have always wanted religion because they like ritual. They like the sense of community. So support groups that are providing an alternative, and Humanist Canada is a really good one. Also, do lots of reading. I mean, there's a book that I read recently that I would have to say is one of the most fascinating books I've ever read. It's called God and Anatomy by Francesca Stavropoulos. And she talks in detail about this anthropomorphic Yahweh and how we know about that. There's just so much that you can learn. Other than that, I don't know, just support groups that are trying to provide a secular alternative and get religion out of government. Get them to stop making the laws.
Okay, another question from the chat. Are there parts of the world that have progressed beyond religion?
Sorry, are you asking if there are other parts of the world?
Yes.
Oh, sure. Like those countries I listed, like Finland and Sweden and all of those Scandinavian countries, they have hardly any religious people. They have definitely progressed beyond it, and they have better human rights. They have so much more equality among women, like for women in the culture. Like a whole year of maternity leave. Like they want people to take good care of their children. They want, they're not trying to just build an army of workers, an army of low-wage workers. They really care about all the individuals. Yes, there are definitely cultures that have progressed beyond religion.
Thank you. Bird, I'm not sure. Can you please clarify your question? Is there another research project like yours about Asian culture, patriarchal culture, or religious history? I'm not sure.
Yeah, there probably are, but I'm not involved with any of the Asian research in that area.
Okay, do you think that most religious stories were deliberately invented by the leaders, or were they the result of stories being told and retold and slowly transformed into the stories we know now?
There's some of both. Like I explained about when the elites from Judea were taken away to Babylon, they very purposely made up that whole new history, that whole thing about the captivity in Egypt and the Exodus and all that. That was done deliberately. A lot of the other stories, I think, some of them could have just evolved from earlier legends and earlier things that people thought and believed. And a lot of the stuff about Jesus, for example, is just copied from earlier legends from other cultures about their seasonal dying and rising gods that, represented the growing season. So, there's a combination there. There's a lot of both. And if you're interested in more about Jesus, I could recommend this book on the historicity of Jesus by Richard Carrier. It's a very heavy academic tome, but he does have a lighter version that condenses a lot of that information. It's called Jesus from Outer Space, because he talks about how the earliest Jesus was never really an earthly being. It was a spiritual story. But there's a lot of blending of myths and stories and legends and deliberate stories.
Okay, and I cannot help asking this question. Ronald Dworkin has a book called Religion Without God. Can there be a religion without a God or gods?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, because what is a religion? You have to define what a religion is. Some definitions say it's a common set of beliefs and practices and rituals. And if you look at it that way, we can say that humanism is a religion. Now, some people would object to that because there's no deity, but depending on your definition, you don't have to have a deity to have a religion. Buddhism doesn't have a deity, and it's considered a religion. So we could have a religion based on the planet being the thing that we consider most sacred. Yeah, you can definitely have a religion without a God.
Okay, well, let's take one last question. Speaking of books, out of curiosity, question from Fuad. Out of curiosity, have you read the recent book, The Dawn of Everything by Graeber and Wengrow? It completely debunked.
What was the name of the book?
The Dawn of Everything.
Oh, no, I haven't, but I'll look that up. I've read Sapiens and a lot of these other books that are talking about the evolution of human history. And that sounds like that might be interesting too. Thanks.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Karis. This was very informative, very lively, and a couple of announcements as we wrap up. If you have a moment to share your thoughts about the webinar or suggest a webinar topic or speaker, please fill out our survey. You will find the link in Zoom's follow-up email.
Can I make one more comment?
For sure, yes.
In the sense of popularizing this information and making it accessible to more people, if anybody out there is a good graphic artist and would like to work on turning this information into a graphic novel style book that's like a comic book, but book size, we should talk. You can get in touch with me later because I think that would be a way to get it out there to more people.
Would you like to put your email maybe in the chat? Or would you like people to reach out to me?
Oh yeah, they can reach out to you, and you could give the Karis at imagineceremonies.com.
There you go. And we did have a couple of questions in the chat about your book. So again, you can purchase it at our online store. I believe someone said that there is a glitch with the payment system, so please reach out to me. I put my email in the chat box and we'll sort this out. And I would like to mention that our next webinar will be on July 26th at 6 p.m. Eastern time this time. And we will be joined by Jill Doktorov, the Executive Director of the National Abortion Federation of Canada, who will talk about abortion rights in the context of the alarming developments in the US. As you probably know, the Supreme Court just overturned the historic case Roe v. Wade, and Karis, you mentioned that as well. And finally, I would like to mention that we are supported by membership and donations. So if you would like to become a member of Humanist Canada or contribute to our educational programs, including these webinar series, you can do so on our website, www.humanistcanada.ca. And once again, thank you, Karis, so much for your presentation. Thank you, everybody, for attending. If you don't have any last words, well,
I don't know. I'm donating the books to Humanist Canada. So if you're going to buy one from Humanist Canada so that the money will all go to them and it'll help support the work they're doing. We need to make this kind of group grow and be strong.
There you go. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. And see you next time.